Sometimes the words we least expect are the ones that change us forever. In a world where we hide behind walls of anger and pride, it takes just one honest soul to see through to who we really are. In the dusty saloon of Red Creek, a woman storms through the doors, known across 3 counties for her temper and the trail of broken hearts she's left behind. She confronts a quiet mountain man, demanding respect. "Do you know who I am?" she snaps. He looks up calmly and says, "You're the most beautiful woman here." The saloon freezes. Her fury melts. For the first time, she has no answer. What happens when someone sees past everything you've built to protect yourself? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cordelia Van Doren had never been beautiful by accident. Every morning, she sat before her vanity mirror, an exquisite piece framed in mother-of-pearl that had traveled with her family from Philadelphia, and studied her reflection with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. The mirror had been her mother's once, back when the Van Doren name still carried the soft edges of old money rather than the sharp glint of new railroad wealth. Her mother had taught her that beauty was currency, and Cordelia had learned to spend it wisely. She was 28 years old in the summer of 1878, which made her a curiosity in Red Creek, unmarried, uncompromising, and utterly uninterested in the opinions of those she deemed beneath her, which, truth be told, included nearly everyone. "Your hair looks particularly fine today, Miss Cordelia," Martha said, standing behind her with pins held between her lips. Martha Hayes had been with the Van Doren family for 15 years, first as a housemaid in Philadelphia, then as Cordelia's lady's companion when they'd moved west after the war. She was the only person in Red Creek who could speak plainly to Cordelia without fear of retribution, and even she chose her words carefully. "It looks the same as it does every day," Cordelia replied, watching Martha's hands work in the mirror's reflection. "You're being diplomatic, which means you're about to tell me something I won't want to hear." Martha's eyes met hers in the glass. "The Ashford boy came by again this morning. That's the 3rd time this week. And I told him you weren't receiving callers, same as I told him the other 2 times. But Miss Cordelia, you can't keep turning away every man who—" "Can't I?" Cordelia turned on her cushioned stool, fixing Martha with the look that had sent stronger souls scrambling for the door. "Thomas Ashford is a fool with his father's money and his mother's weak chin. I'd sooner marry Dutch's horse." Martha sighed, returning the pins to their silver case. "You're going to run out of eligible men in this territory. Good. Then perhaps they'll all leave me in peace." But peace was not what Cordelia craved, though she'd never admit it aloud. The truth, the one she kept locked away deeper than her father's railroad bonds, was that she was desperately, achingly lonely. Red Creek had been her prison and her kingdom for 5 years now, ever since her father's death had left her one of the wealthiest women west of the Mississippi. She ruled her small empire with an iron fist wrapped in French lace, attending every social function, hosting elaborate dinners, ensuring that her name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. And yet, when she retired to her bedroom each night in the sprawling house on the hill, the one her father had built to prove that civilization could be imported to the frontier, she felt like a ghost, haunting rooms filled with expensive furniture and empty air. Red Creek itself had grown from a rough mining camp into something approaching respectability. 3 years ago, when the railroad came through, it brought with it the promise of progress and the reality of complications. Now the town boasted 2 hotels, a proper bank, a church with a bell tower, and no fewer than 4 saloons competing for the business of cowhands, miners, and the occasional gambler passing through on his way to somewhere more promising. The Golden Spur was the largest and most respectable of these establishments, owned and operated by a Dutch immigrant named Henrik van der Berg, whom everyone called Dutch. He ran a clean operation, no watered whiskey, no marked cards, and a firm policy that violence would be met with the business end of the shotgun he kept under the bar. Cordelia had been inside exactly twice, once when her father was alive and wanted to discuss business with Dutch over brandy, and once 3 years ago when she'd marched in to personally inform a cattle baron that his offer for her hand was declined, and would remain so no matter how many head of cattle he was willing to throw into the bargain. She had no intention of ever entering again, which is why, on that particular Saturday evening in late June, when she found herself standing outside the Golden Spur's swinging doors, with her heart hammering against her rib cage and her pride wound tight as a watch spring, she understood that something fundamental had shifted in the careful architecture of her life. Thomas Ashford, the weak-chinned fool, had sent her a note that afternoon. It was written on expensive paper with his family crest embossed at the top, and it promised her the honor of his company at dinner. At the Golden Spur. At 7 o'clock. He would be waiting. Cordelia had laughed when she read it. Then she'd spent 2 hours dressing in her finest evening gown, deep emerald silk that set off her dark hair and made her green eyes look like cut glass, and had Martha arrange her hair in an elaborate coiffure that had taken the better part of an hour to complete. She wore her mother's pearls and her father's gold watch on a chain around her neck. She looked like money and breeding and everything the frontier was supposed to make irrelevant, but never quite did. She arrived at 7:30, because punctuality was for people who needed to prove something. The Golden Spur was crowded for a Saturday night, filled with the usual mix of ranch hands spending their wages, traveling salesmen trading stories, and locals who'd long ago given up on the pretense that they were just passing through. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey, leather, and sweat. A piano player in the corner was working his way through a melody that might have been Stephen Foster if you were drunk enough not to notice the wrong notes. Cordelia swept through the doors like a queen entering a throne room, and the conversation didn't so much stop as stumble over itself. Every eye in the place turned to her. She was used to this. She'd cultivated it, in fact, the ability to command a room simply by entering it. Dutch looked up from behind the bar, his weathered face creasing into something between a smile and a wince. "Miss Van Doren," he said carefully. "This is unexpected." "Is Thomas Ashford here?" she asked, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. Dutch glanced toward a table in the back corner, then back at her. His expression told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. "He was here, ma'am. Left about an hour ago. Had a bottle and some company, if you take my meaning. Didn't mention he was expecting anyone." The humiliation hit her like a slap. Every person in that saloon knew exactly what had happened. Thomas Ashford, weak-chinned, wealthy, acceptable Thomas Ashford, had stood her up, had made a fool of her, had probably laughed about it with whatever soiled dove he'd hired for the evening. Cordelia's face remained perfectly composed, but something cold and furious was rising in her chest. Her eyes swept the room, looking for somewhere to direct the storm building inside her, some target that would allow her to leave with her dignity intact. That's when she saw him. He was sitting alone at a table near the wall, a glass of whiskey in front of him, and a book in his hands. A book in a saloon. He was broad-shouldered and rough-looking, wearing simple clothes that had seen hard use, canvas pants, a worn flannel shirt, scuffed boots. His hair was dark and a bit too long, brushing his collar. His face was weathered in a way that spoke of years spent outdoors, and there was something about the way he sat, relaxed, self-contained, utterly unconcerned with the drama unfolding around him, that made Cordelia's fury find its focus. He was reading. While she stood there, humiliated, he was reading as if nothing in the world mattered more than whatever was on those pages. She crossed the room in 6 strides, her skirts rustling with barely contained rage. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. He looked up slowly, and she saw his eyes for the first time. They were grey, like winter smoke, and they regarded her with a calm curiosity that only fed her anger. "Ma'am," he said quietly, marking his place in the book with one finger. "Do you know who I am?" The question came out louder than she'd intended, and she was dimly aware that the entire saloon was watching this exchange with rapt attention. He studied her for a long moment. There was no fear in his expression, no desire to please or placate. He simply looked at her as if she were a puzzle he was trying to work out. Then he smiled, just a slight curve of his mouth that held no mockery, no agenda, nothing but a simple warmth that she hadn't expected. "You're the most beautiful woman here," he said. The words hung in the smoky air between them. Around them, the saloon had gone absolutely silent. Even the piano player had stopped mid-chord. Cordelia opened her mouth to respond, to cut him down with the razor wit she'd perfected over years of dismissing unwanted attention. But nothing came out. The fury that had been burning in her chest had simply vanished, replaced by something she couldn't name. Confusion. Wonder. A strange, unfamiliar softness that terrified her more than any insult ever could. He hadn't said she was beautiful to flatter her. He hadn't said it to win her favor or curry advantage. He'd said it the way someone might comment on the color of the sky, as a simple statement of observable fact. And somehow, that made all the difference. She turned and walked out of the Golden Spur without another word, her expensive skirts whispering across the wooden floor. Behind her, the saloon erupted into conversation, but she barely heard it. Her heart was pounding, her face was flushed, and her carefully ordered world had just tilted on its axis. Martha was waiting up when she returned home, concern etched across her kind face. "Miss Cordelia, are you all right? You look—" "I'm fine," Cordelia said quickly, removing her gloves with hands that weren't quite steady. "I'm perfectly fine." But as she climbed the stairs to her room and sat before her mother's mirror, she knew it was a lie. She touched her reflection in the glass, tracing the familiar features that had been her armor and her currency for so long. "You're the most beautiful woman here." 5 simple words from a stranger, and somehow they'd cracked something open inside her that she'd thought was sealed shut forever. She didn't sleep that night. And when dawn came creeping through her curtains, Cordelia Van Doren found herself thinking, not about the humiliation of being stood up, not about Thomas Ashford and his weak chin, but about a quiet man with grey eyes who'd looked at her and seen something other than what she'd spent years making sure everyone would see. It should have been nothing, a passing moment in a frontier saloon. Instead, it felt like the beginning of everything. The man's name was Silas Mackenzie, and by Tuesday afternoon, Cordelia knew more about him than she cared to admit. She hadn't asked directly, of course. That would have been beneath her dignity. Instead, she'd let information come to her the way water flows downhill, naturally, inevitably, through the carefully cultivated network of gossip and observation that had always served her well. Martha had mentioned, quite casually over breakfast on Sunday, that the mountain man who'd caused such a stir at the Golden Spur was a trapper who came down from the high country every few weeks for supplies. Mrs. Henderson at the general store had added, during Cordelia's Monday visit to order new stationery, that he was unfailingly polite and paid his bills in full, often with pelts of remarkable quality. And Dutch himself, when Cordelia had sent Martha with a carefully worded inquiry about Saturday's events, had reported that Silas Mackenzie was about the quietest, most peaceable man he'd ever known. Never drank more than 2 glasses, never raised his voice, and once broke up a fight between 2 miners without throwing a single punch. Just stepped between them, Dutch had told Martha, and said something in that calm way of his. Don't even know what the words were, but both men put down their fists and walked away, looking ashamed of themselves. Never seen anything like it. Cordelia had listened to all of this with feigned disinterest, while her mind worked like a mill wheel, turning the information over and over. She told herself she was simply curious. It was natural to want to understand the man who'd caused such an upheaval in her carefully ordered evening. Nothing more than that. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. The truth was that she couldn't stop thinking about those 5 words. They played in her mind at odd moments, while she was reviewing her father's ledgers, while she was pretending to listen to Mrs. Ashford's apology for her son's behavior, while she lay in bed staring at the ceiling and wondering why a simple compliment from a stranger had affected her more than 100 flowery speeches from men who supposedly wanted to marry her. By Wednesday morning, she'd made a decision that surprised even herself. She was going to see him again. Not at the saloon. That would be too obvious, too much like chasing after him. But Red Creek was a small town, and patterns were easy enough to discern if you paid attention. According to Mrs. Henderson, Silas came into the general store every other Thursday morning to trade pelts and purchase supplies. Tomorrow was Thursday. Cordelia had not set foot in Henderson's general store in over a year. She had an account there, naturally, but Martha handled the actual shopping. It was beneath a woman of her station to be seen comparing prices on flour or fingering bolts of calico like some farmer's wife. Yet on Thursday morning, she found herself standing in her bedroom, debating between 3 different day dresses, while Martha watched with barely concealed amusement. "The blue one is lovely," Martha offered. "I'm not trying to look lovely," Cordelia snapped. "I'm simply going to purchase some ribbon for a hat." "Of course, Miss Cordelia. The ribbon you already have 3 boxes of in your dressing room." Cordelia shot her a look that would have withered a lesser woman. Martha simply smiled and helped her into the blue dress. Henderson's general store occupied a prominent corner on Main Street, its wide windows displaying everything from farm implements to fancy goods imported from San Francisco. A bell jangled as Cordelia pushed open the door, and Mrs. Henderson looked up from behind the counter with an expression of such surprise that Cordelia almost turned around and walked back out. "Miss Van Doren, what a pleasant surprise. How may I help you today?" "Ribbon," Cordelia said crisply, moving toward the dry goods section. "Blue, if you have it." Of course. Let me just— Oh, good morning, Mr. Mackenzie." Cordelia's heart lurched. She turned, trying to look casual, and there he was. Silas Mackenzie stood just inside the doorway, a bundle of pelts over one shoulder, and that same calm expression on his weathered face. He wore different clothes than he had at the saloon, buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt, but he carried himself with the same quiet self-possession that had struck her before. His eyes found hers immediately, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Ma'am," he said, touching his fingers to his forehead in a small gesture of respect. "Mr. Mackenzie." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Mrs. Henderson looked between them with the expression of a woman who'd just witnessed something worth remembering. "I'll just get those pelts weighed, Mr. Mackenzie. And Miss Van Doren, the ribbon is right over—" "I can find it," Cordelia said quickly. She moved to the far side of the store, pretending to examine spools of ribbon, while her pulse hammered in her ears. Behind her, she could hear the low rumble of Silas's voice as he conducted his business with Mrs. Henderson. She risked a glance over her shoulder and found him watching her. He looked away immediately, but not before she caught something in his expression. A question, perhaps, or a recognition of the strangeness of this encounter. Cordelia made her selection, a blue ribbon she didn't need, and waited while Silas finished his transaction. She told herself she was simply being polite, not wanting to interrupt. She told herself she would leave right after him, not with him. She told herself a lot of things that morning. He was turning to go, his business concluded, when she heard herself speak. "Mr. Mackenzie." He stopped, turning back to face her. "Yes, ma'am?" Now that she had his attention, she had no idea what to say. The words she'd rehearsed in her mind, casual, controlled, dignified, had evaporated like morning dew. She stood there holding a spool of blue ribbon, feeling more foolish than she had in years. "I wanted to." She paused, searching for the right words. "Saturday night, at the saloon. I was having a difficult evening, and I took my frustration out on you unfairly. I apologize." It was probably the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in months, and it cost her something to say it. Silas studied her with those grey eyes, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he was seeing past all her careful defenses to something true underneath. "No apology necessary, Miss Van Doren. We all have difficult evenings. You know my name." She hadn't meant it as a question, but it came out that way. Hard not to, in a town this size. There was no mockery in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. Especially when folks can't stop talking about something. Her cheeks warmed. Yes, I suppose Saturday provided enough gossip to last the town a month. At least. The corner of his mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Though I've learned that mountain lions make poor conversationalists, so I can't say I mind the attention when I come down to town." It took her a moment to realize he was making a joke, gentle, self-deprecating. She felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest, and realized with shock that it was laughter. Real laughter, not the practiced social performance she'd perfected years ago. "You live alone in the mountains?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded like prying, but Silas didn't seem to mind. "Yes, ma'am. Have a cabin up near Eagle Ridge. It's quiet up there. Peaceful. A man can hear himself think." "That sounds lonely." "Does it?" He tilted his head slightly, considering. "I've always found there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. One's a choice. The other's a condition." The words struck her with unexpected force. She'd spent 5 years surrounded by people, at parties, at dinners, at social functions that filled her calendar like an endless parade of obligation. Yet she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt anything but lonely. "That's very philosophical for a Thursday morning," she said, trying to regain her footing. "I read a lot." He shifted the bundle of supplies under his arm. "Not much else to do when winter snow keeps you inside for weeks at a time." She remembered the book he'd been reading at the saloon. "What do you read?" "Whatever I can get my hands on. Last winter, I worked through most of Shakespeare, Emerson's essays, and the complete works of Marcus Aurelius that some prospector traded me for 2 fox pelts and a smoked ham." Cordelia stared at him. In her experience, frontier men fell into 2 categories: those who could barely write their own names, and those who'd had enough education back east to be dangerous with pretension. Silas Mackenzie seemed to fit neither category. "You've read Marcus Aurelius," she said slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "You sound surprised." "I am. Most men of my acquaintance consider reading a waste of time better spent making money or showing off their horsemanship." "Can't say I'm most men." He said it simply, without pride or false modesty. "And seems to me that reading is how a person makes acquaintance with minds better than their own. I may not have much, Miss Van Doren, but I've got time and I've got curiosity. That's enough." She wanted to ask him more, about what he thought of Aurelius, about what he'd learned from Emerson, about how a mountain trapper had come to develop such a thoughtful view of the world. But Mrs. Henderson was watching them with unconcealed interest, and Cordelia could practically hear the gossip already forming. "I should let you get back to your preparations," she said, falling back on formality-like armor. "I'm sure you have a long journey ahead of you." "Yes, ma'am." He touched his fingers to his forehead again. "It was a pleasure talking with you." He turned to go, and she felt something like panic flutter in her chest. He was leaving. She wouldn't see him for another 2 weeks, maybe longer, and something about that felt unbearable. "Mr. Mackenzie." He paused at the door, looking back. "Your cabin, near Eagle Ridge. Is it—" She stopped herself, but he waited patiently for her to continue. "Is it very beautiful up there?" His expression softened. "Most beautiful place I've ever seen. The mountains turn purple at sunset, and the air is so clear you can see stars you didn't know existed. There's a creek runs past my cabin that sounds like music when it hits the rocks." He paused, then added quietly, "You'd be welcome to see it sometime if you wanted. I mean no disrespect by the offer, just it seems like the kind of place a person ought to see at least once." Her heart was hammering again. "That's very kind of you. Just an open invitation, no pressure behind it." He nodded once more and stepped out into the bright morning sunshine. Cordelia stood frozen in place, the spool of blue ribbon clutched in her hand, while Mrs. Henderson began weighing her purchase with hands that trembled slightly with the effort not to immediately rush out and spread this new development across town. An invitation to his cabin, to see the mountains. It was improper, scandalous even. No unmarried woman of her standing would ever consider accepting such an offer from a man she barely knew, which is why, as Cordelia walked home with her unnecessary ribbon, she found herself already planning how she might accept. That evening, she sat at her writing desk with a leather journal she'd kept sporadically since girlhood. Most entries were brief, perfunctory, social events attended, obligations fulfilled. But tonight she wrote several pages, trying to capture the feeling of that conversation in the general store, the way Silas had spoken about solitude and beauty and Marcus Aurelius, as if they were all equally worthy of consideration. At the bottom of the page, she wrote a single question. "What am I doing?" She had no answer. But for the first time in years, the uncertainty felt less like weakness and more like possibility. Outside her window, the summer night was warm and full of stars. Somewhere up in those dark mountains, a man was probably sitting by a fire, reading a book, living a life that bore no resemblance to anything she'd ever known. And she wanted, more than she'd wanted anything in a very long time, to understand what that might feel like. The mountains were everything Silas had promised, and more than Cordelia had imagined. They left Red Creek just after dawn on Sunday, while mist still clung to the valley floor, and the town was quiet except for the early church bells. Cordelia had dressed simply, a plain cotton dress, practical boots, her hair in a single braid down her back. Martha had insisted she take a shawl and had packed a basket with food enough for two, her knowing smile saying everything her words didn't. The wagon road climbed steadily, winding through pine forests that smelled of resin and earth. Silas drove with easy confidence, pointing out landmarks. A lightning-struck tree where eagles nested, a clearing where he'd once watched a bear teach her cubs to fish, a particular rock formation that looked different from every angle. "My cabin's about another hour up," he said, as they stopped to let the horses drink from a clear stream. "But I wanted to show you something first." He helped her down from the wagon, his hand warm and steady on hers, and led her up a narrow trail that switchbacked through aspens. The trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves trembling gold against the deep blue sky. After 20 minutes of climbing, they emerged onto a rocky outcrop. Cordelia stopped, hand to her chest, breathless from both the altitude and the view. The entire valley spread below them like a painting. Red Creek was a toy town in the distance, and beyond it, the plains rolled away to the horizon in shades of gold and green. Behind them, the mountains rose in wave after wave of stone and forest, their peaks still holding last winter's snow. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, Silas." He stood beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "This is where I come when I need to remember what matters, when the small problems of the world start feeling too big." She understood. Up here, with all that space and beauty surrounding them, the careful social structures of Red Creek seemed absurd. What did it matter if she'd worn the right dress to the right party? If she'd said the right things to the right people? None of it was real. This was real. Stone and sky and the wind in the pines. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "Thank you for wanting to come." They stood in comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle on thermal currents far below them. Finally, Cordelia spoke the truth that had been building in her chest for weeks. "I lost someone once. My younger brother Samuel. He was only 12 when he died." She kept her eyes on the distant horizon, not trusting herself to look at Silas while she spoke. "There was a land dispute back in Pennsylvania. My father was trying to acquire property for the railroad. The man who owned it refused to sell. There were threats, escalating tensions. Samuel was playing near the disputed boundary when..." Her voice caught. "They said it was an accident, a spooked horse, a tragic coincidence. But I've always known it was connected to my father's ambitions." She felt Silas's hand cover hers on the rock between them. He didn't speak, just waited. "After that, my father became obsessed with success, with building something that would outlast him. We moved west. He accumulated land, money, power, and she laughed bitterly. "I built my own walls, made myself untouchable so nothing could hurt me again. It seemed safer that way." "Was it?" Silas asked quietly. "Safer?" She finally looked at him, and the understanding in his grey eyes nearly undid her. "No, it was just lonely." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm sorry about your brother. That kind of loss, it changes you. Makes you question what you thought you knew about the world." "Did you lose someone too?" "My mother, when I was 15. Fever took her one winter." "My father." He paused, and she saw something complicated cross his face. "He didn't handle it well. Got angry at the world, at God, at anyone who tried to help. That anger poisoned everything. That's when I learned that sometimes you have to walk away from the people you love to save yourself." "Is that why you live alone in the mountains?" "Part of it." He turned to face her fully. But it's also because I found something up here that I couldn't find anywhere else. Peace, I suppose. The chance to be myself without having to pretend to be something else. I envy you that, Cordelia said. I've been pretending for so long I'm not sure I remember who I really am. I think you do. His thumb traced a gentle circle on the back of her hand. I think you're remembering right now. The intimacy of the moment, standing on a mountain with him, their hands joined, their truths laid bare between them, should have frightened her, should have sent her retreating behind her usual defenses. Instead, she felt something like relief. "Show me your cabin," she said. "Please." The cabin was small and sturdy, built from logs chinked with mud and moss. It sat in a clearing beside a creek that did indeed sound like music as it tumbled over smooth stones. Inside was one room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed covered with furs, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies, and a rocking chair positioned near the window to catch the light. It was the most peaceful place Cordelia had ever seen. "It's not much," Silas said, suddenly self-conscious. "But it's home. It's perfect." She ran her hand along the back of the rocking chair, imagining him sitting there through long winter nights, reading by lantern light. "Did you build it yourself?" "Most of it. Had some help with the roof from a fellow trapper who was passing through. Took me the better part of 2 summers, but I wasn't in a hurry." She noticed things as she explored the small space. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, carved animals lining one shelf, a journal open on the bed with sketches of mountain landscapes. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a home shaped by solitude and care. "The books," she said, moving to examine the shelf. "You really do read everything. Got to keep the mind sharp." He moved to stand beside her, pointing out volumes. "That Shakespeare you see there. Traded 6 beaver pelts for it. Worth every one. The Emerson came from a widow in town who was selling off her late husband's library. The Marcus Aurelius I told you about." He pulled down a worn leather volume. "This one's my favorite, though. Thoreau. Walden. Ever read it?" "No." "Here." He pressed it into her hands. "Borrow it. I think you'll appreciate what he has to say about simple living and finding yourself in nature." She clutched the book to her chest, touched by the gesture. "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will." They ate lunch by the creek, sharing Martha's carefully packed food: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples from someone's orchard. Silas told her about his life in the mountains, the rhythm of the seasons, the animals he'd befriended, the storms he'd weathered. Cordelia found herself talking about things she never discussed with anyone: her fear of becoming like her father, her complicated relationship with her wealth, her loneliness in crowds. As the afternoon sun slanted through the pines, she realized she was happier than she'd been in years, maybe ever. "We should head back," Silas said reluctantly, as shadows began to lengthen. "Don't want to have you out after dark. People talk enough as it is." "Let them talk." But she stood, brushing pine needles from her skirt. "Though Martha will worry if I'm too late." On the ride back down the mountain, Cordelia leaned against Silas's shoulder, exhausted and content. He didn't comment, just adjusted his arm to make her more comfortable. "Can I come back?" she asked, as Red Creek came into view below them. "To see the mountains?" "Anytime you want. Door's always open to you, Cordelia." When he dropped her at her house, just as the sun was setting, they sat in the wagon for a long moment, neither quite ready to let the day end. "Thank you," she said finally, "for today, for all of it. Thank you for trusting me with your story, with your truth." She climbed down, turned back. "Silas, I meant what I said up there, about being tired of pretending. I think I'm ready to stop." He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Then I'll be right here while you figure out who you really are." That night, she opened the Thoreau and read by lamplight until dawn, underlining passages that spoke to her newly awakening soul. And in her journal, she wrote, "I went to the mountains today and found myself there. Or maybe I found the courage to start looking. The change in Cordelia did not go unnoticed. Within a week, the ladies of Red Creek Social Circle were whispering about her transformation. She no longer wore her most elaborate dresses to routine errands. She'd been seen walking unaccompanied beyond the edge of town. Most scandalous of all, she'd declined an invitation to Mrs. Ashford's annual garden party, an event that, in previous years, she would have attended, if only to assert her social dominance. "You're causing quite the stir," Martha observed one morning, as she helped Cordelia into a simple cotton dress. "Mrs. Patterson stopped me at the market yesterday to ask if you were feeling well." "I'm feeling better than I have in years," Cordelia replied, fastening her father's pocket watch to her belt. She'd taken to wearing it every day now, a tangible connection to the past she was finally making peace with. Let them whisper. But the whispers weren't her only concern. The Brennan-Hartley feud had escalated again. 2 days ago, someone had cut the Hartleys' fence lines, letting half their cattle wander onto disputed territory. Yesterday, the Brennans found one of their prize bulls, shot dead in its pasture. The town was on edge, waiting for the violence to explode into something that couldn't be undone. Cordelia knew she held the key to ending it. The deed to the disputed valley land was in her safe, right beside her mother's jewelry and her father's will. She'd looked at it 12 times in the past week, running her fingers over the legal language, over her father's bold signature at the bottom. The deed had been acquired in a transaction dated 3 months after Samuel's death. Her father had bought it from a desperate widow for a fraction of its value, adding it to his growing empire. Cordelia had discovered it among his papers after his death, along with a ledger noting that the land in question was the same parcel that had sparked the Pennsylvania dispute, the one that had somehow, through a chain of circumstances she'd never fully understood, led to Samuel being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her father had won that fight. He'd gotten his land, built his railroad, made his fortune, and Samuel had paid the price. Now history was threatening to repeat itself with the Brennans and Hartleys. More blood over the same cursed piece of earth. The thought made her physically ill. "Miss Cordelia." Martha's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Mr. Mackenzie is here. Says he hoped you might join him for a walk." Cordelia found Silas waiting on the porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in what were clearly his best clothes. The sight made her smile despite her troubled thoughts. "You dressed up," she observed. "Figured if we're going to be seen together, regular-like, might as well look respectable." He offered his arm. "Walk with me?" They headed away from town, toward the creek that marked the eastern boundary of Red Creek's respectable limits. Once they were out of sight of curious eyes, Silas spoke. "Something's troubling you. I can see it in your face." She shouldn't have been surprised that he could read her so well. They'd spent nearly every day together for the past 3 weeks. Carving lessons on her porch, long walks through the countryside, Sunday visits to his cabin that had become a cherished ritual. She'd learned the geography of his face as thoroughly as she'd learned the mountains he loved. "The Brennan-Hartley land," she said finally. "I know something about it that could end the feud. But telling what I know would mean revealing things about my father, about my past, that I've kept hidden for years." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing this. The deed. You have the deed to the disputed land. It wasn't a question. She stopped walking, staring at him. How did you? Figured it out a while back. Your father owned most of the territory rights around here. Made sense that Parcel would be part of his holdings, and the way you reacted when I mentioned the feud that first time, he shrugged, wasn't hard to put together. You knew, and you didn't say anything? It's your business, your secret. Figured you'd tell me when you were ready. His grey eyes were steady on hers. Are you ready now? She told him everything then, about Samuel, about the Pennsylvania dispute, about her father's ruthless acquisition of the very land that had indirectly killed his son, about how she'd been holding on to the deed like a talisman, as if keeping it secret could somehow undo the past. I'm afraid, she admitted, afraid that releasing it means accepting what my father did, afraid it will honor the violence that took Samuel from me. Silas took her hands in his. Cordelia, keeping that deed hidden won't bring your brother back, but releasing it could prevent someone else from losing a brother, a son, a father. Seems to me that might be the best way to honor Samuel's memory, making sure his death wasn't for nothing. The truth of his words hit her like a physical force. She'd been so focused on protecting her grief, nursing her anger at her father, that she hadn't considered she might have the power to stop history from repeating itself. The town council is meeting tomorrow night, she said slowly. About the feud. They're trying to find a solution before someone else gets killed. Then tomorrow night might be the time to tell your truth. Will you come with me? To the meeting? If you want me there, I'll be there. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his shoulder. His arms came around her, steady and strong. I don't know if I can do this alone. Good thing you're not alone, then. That evening, Cordelia sat at her father's desk, her desk, now, and pulled out the deed. She unfolded it carefully, reading through the legal language one more time. Then she opened the drawer where she'd found the tin of pressed flowers, where Samuel's memory lived in petals and paper. She was ready to let both go, ready to release the past and step into whatever future awaited her. The pocket watch ticked steadily on her belt, marking time that moved forward whether she was ready or not. But for the first time in 15 years, she felt like she was moving with it rather than being dragged behind. Tomorrow, she would tell the truth. Tomorrow, she would try to make something good come from the tragedy that had shaped her life. Tomorrow, she would stand before the town and risk everything she'd built for the chance at something real. But tonight, she allowed herself to sit with Silas on her back porch, his hand warm in hers, while the stars came out one by one over Red Creek and the mountains beyond. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said quietly, I want you to know that you've changed my life. You've helped me remember who I wanted to be before I forgot. He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. You did that yourself, Cordelia. I just had the privilege of watching. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, and Cordelia felt something she hadn't felt in years settle into her bones like coming home. Hope. The Red Creek Town Council met in the back room of the First Presbyterian Church because it was the only building large enough to hold the crowd that had gathered. Every family with stake in the dispute was there, along with concerned citizens who feared the violence would spill over into the rest of the community. Cordelia arrived with Silas at her side, and Martha following close behind. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a leather portfolio containing the deed. Her father's pocket watch felt heavy at her waist, its steady tick like a heartbeat against her hip. The room fell silent as she entered. Eyes tracked her movement to the front, where Mayor Preston and the council members sat behind a long table. She was aware of the whispers, the speculation about why the wealthiest woman in Red Creek had come to a meeting about a land dispute she supposedly had no connection to. Tom Brennan sat with his sons on one side of the room. Jack Hartley and his family occupied the other. The space between them crackled with hostility. "Miss Van Doren," Mayor Preston said, surprise evident in his voice. "We weren't expecting you this evening." "I know, Mayor, but I have information relevant to this dispute." She placed the portfolio on the table. Information that should have been shared long ago. Silas found a seat near the back, his presence a steady comfort even at a distance. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded, a small gesture of encouragement. Cordelia opened the portfolio and withdrew the deed. The paper was yellowed with age, its folds worn soft. The bottom right corner was a small stain that could have been anything, but that she knew was blood. Her father's, from a paper cut he'd gotten the day he signed it. She'd watched him blot it impatiently, annoyed at the imperfection. "This is the legal deed to the disputed valley land," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It was purchased by my father, Marcus Van Doren, in 1863. Upon his death, ownership transferred to me. Legally speaking, the land belongs to neither the Brennans nor the Hartleys. It belongs to the Van Doren estate. It belongs to me." The room erupted. Tom Brennan surged to his feet, his face red with rage. "That's impossible. My father settled that land in 58. "Your father had a squatter's claim," Cordelia replied calmly. "Not a legal deed. The same is true of the Hartley claim. Neither family ever held legal title." Jack Hartley stood more slowly, his lean face hard with suspicion. "Why are you telling us this now? Why hide it all these years?" This was the moment she'd been dreading. The moment when she would have to expose not just her father's actions, but her own complicity in keeping the secret. "Because I was a coward," she said simply. The brutal honesty of it silenced the room. "Because this land, or land very like it, cost me my brother's life when I was 13 years old. There was a dispute in Pennsylvania over property my father wanted for his railroad. A boy died. My brother, Samuel. He was 12 years old, playing near the boundary of the disputed land when violence erupted. They said it was an accident, but I've always known it was connected to my father's ambitions." She had to pause, her throat tight with emotion. Martha had moved closer, a silent support. 3 months after Samuel's death, my father purchased this deed. The valley land here in Colorado. The same land you've been fighting over. I think he saw it as somehow finishing what Samuel's death had started. As if acquiring enough land, building enough empire, could make up for losing his son. Her hands trembled as she held up the deed. "I've kept this hidden because I was angry at my father for valuing land over life. Because every time I looked at it, I saw my brother's face. But keeping it hidden hasn't changed anything. It hasn't brought Samuel back. And now I watch you two families moving toward the same violence that took him from me. And I realize," her voice broke. She took a breath, steadied herself. "I realize that I have the power to stop it. So I'm here tonight to tell you that I'm donating this land to the town of Red Creek. Neither family will own it. Instead, it will be used to build a school, a place of learning and growth instead of violence and death, a place that honors life instead of taking it." The silence that followed was profound. Cordelia could hear the hiss of the gas lamps, the creak of wood as people shifted in their seats, the wild hammering of her own heart. Then Silas stood up. The movement drew every eye in the room. "Miss Van Doren is right," he said, in that calm, measured voice she'd come to love. "This feud has gone on long enough. It's time to— Sit down, boy." Tom Brennan's voice was sharp with authority. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually, Tom, it concerns him quite a bit." The new voice came from the doorway, where an older man stood silhouetted against the evening light. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with grey hair and eyes that were achingly familiar. Silas went rigid beside his chair. "Pa." Cordelia's heart stopped. "Pa." The older man walked into the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "My name is Jacob Brennan," he said, addressing the room but keeping his eyes fixed on Silas. "Tom here is my younger brother, and that man," he pointed at Silas, "that's my son, Silas Brennan Mackenzie." The room exploded into chaos. Cordelia felt the world tilt sideways. She gripped the edge of the table for support, staring at Silas across the crowded room. Brennan. He was a Brennan. All this time, all these weeks of sharing her heart, her secrets, her truth, he'd been part of the family fighting over the very land her father's greed had helped destroy, the land connected to Samuel's death. "I didn't know." Silas's voice cut through the noise, and she realized he was looking directly at her. "Cordelia, I swear to you, I didn't know about the deed." But did it matter? He'd known who he was. He'd known his family was part of this feud, and he'd never said a word. Jacob Brennan was still talking, explaining that Silas had left the family 15 years ago, taken his mother's maiden name, rejected the Brennan legacy of anger and violence. But Cordelia barely heard it. Her mind was spinning, trying to reorder everything she thought she knew. Had he been using her? Getting close to her to find out about the deed? The thought was like a knife between her ribs. "Miss Van Doren." Tom Brennan's voice was hard. "Did you know about this? That you were courting with a Brennan while sitting on our land deed?" "I didn't. I wasn't." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't think straight. Silas was moving toward her through the crowd, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't. Please just don't." The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Whether he'd known about the deed or not, he'd kept his identity secret. He'd let her pour out her heart about her father and the land and Samuel, all while knowing he had his own connection to the dispute. "I need to go." She gathered up the deed with shaking hands. "Mayor Preston, I'll leave this with you. Do what's right with it. Build the school. End this feud." She looked around the room, at all the shocked faces. "And for God's sake, stop letting anger and pride destroy your lives." She pushed through the crowd, Martha close behind her. Behind her, she heard Silas calling her name. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. If she stopped, she would shatter completely. The night air outside was cold and sharp, shocking after the stuffy warmth of the meeting room. Cordelia made it to the edge of the churchyard before her legs gave out. She sank onto a bench beneath an oak tree, her whole body shaking. "Oh, Miss Cordelia." Martha sat beside her, pulling her close. "Oh, honey." "He lied to me," Cordelia whispered, "or kept the truth from me, which amounts to the same thing. I trusted him, Martha. I let him see me, the real me, and all along he was keeping secrets. Maybe he had his reasons. What reasons could possibly justify this?" She pulled away, anger beginning to burn through the shock. "I told him about Samuel, about my father and that cursed land. And he sat there and listened and never once said, 'Oh, by the way, I'm part of one of the families fighting over it.'" She heard footsteps approaching and knew without looking that it was Silas. She stood up, putting distance between them. "Cordelia, please, let me explain." "Explain what? That you lied? That you manipulated me?" "I never lied to you." His face was anguished in the lamplight. "I never asked about the deed. I never tried to use you for information. I left my family 15 years ago, precisely because I didn't want any part of their feuds and anger. I took my mother's name to separate myself from all of it." "But you never told me who you were." "Would you have given me a chance if I had?" The question stopped her cold. "If I'd walked up to you that first day and said, 'Hello, I'm Silas Brennan,' would you have shared a single honest word with me? Or would you have seen me as just another connection to the land that killed your brother?" The terrible thing was, he was right. If she'd known, she would have built walls between them so high and thick that nothing could have penetrated them. But that didn't make his deception hurt any less. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think. Please, Silas, just give me time." She saw the pain in his eyes, but he nodded. "Whatever you need, Cordelia. But know this. Everything between us was real. My feelings for you are real. That hasn't changed, and it won't change." She turned away before he could see her cry, letting Martha guide her home through streets that suddenly felt strange and unfamiliar, as if the whole world had shifted while she wasn't paying attention. In her room, she sat before her mother's mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back was different from the one who'd stormed into the Golden Spur all those weeks ago. That woman had been armored and alone. This woman was vulnerable and heartbroken and terrified. But she was real. She was finally, achingly real. And that, somehow, would have to be enough to see her through whatever came next. They rode through the night with nothing but starlight and determination to guide them. Silas led the way on his sure-footed mountain horse, with Cordelia following close behind on the strongest mare from Dutch's stable. The pass he'd mentioned was less a road than a suggestion, a narrow trail that wound between sheer rock faces and dropped away into darkness on one side. Cordelia had never been so terrified in her life. She'd also never felt so alive. They didn't speak much during the ride, conserving energy for the horses and their own bodies. But every time the trail grew particularly treacherous, Silas would pause and wait for her, his hand reaching back to steady her horse or point out a safer path. The simple care in those gestures kept her going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. They reached Denver just after midnight, the territorial office dark and closed. But Silas knew a clerk who owed him a favor, something about a rescued daughter and a winter storm. And within an hour they were inside, frantically drafting a petition by candlelight. Cordelia wrote in her finest script, invoking her father's name and connections, citing historical precedent and territorial law. Silas added descriptions of the sacred hot springs, the indigenous history, the ecological importance of the water source. Together, they built a case that the 20 disputed acres should be designated as protected territorial land, held in trust for all citizens rather than claimed by any single family. The clerk, a rumpled man named Peterson, who'd been roused from his bed and wasn't entirely happy about it, read their petition with increasing interest. "This is good work," he admitted finally. "Solid legal reasoning, proper documentation. But Miss Van Doren, you understand that even if I file this tonight, it won't be officially reviewed until the Territorial Committee meets next month." "We don't need official approval," Cordelia said urgently. "We just need documentation that a claim has been filed. Something we can show the families at dawn to prove that the land is now under territorial dispute and cannot be fought over until the matter is legally resolved." Peterson considered this, his weary eyes moving between them. "You're asking me to issue a preliminary injunction based on a midnight filing. I'm asking you to help us prevent bloodshed, she said quietly. Please, Mr. Peterson. These are good people about to do something terrible because they can't see past their own anger. Give us the paperwork we need to make them pause, to make them think. That's all we're asking. He studied her for a long moment, then looked at Silas. You're Jacob Brennan's boy, aren't you? The one who left? Yes, sir. Heard about that. Heard you chose peace over family loyalty. That takes courage. Peterson turned back to his desk and began writing. I'll give you your preliminary injunction. But understand, if this petition gets rejected, if the committee rules against you, those families will just start fighting again. Then we'll deal with that when it comes, Silas said. But at least no one will die tomorrow. Peterson sealed the official documents with the territorial seal and handed them over. Ride safe, and good luck. They were back on their horses within minutes, racing against the dawn. The return journey was harder. They were exhausted, the horses were tired, and the sky was already beginning to lighten with the threat of sunrise. Cordelia's whole body ached. Her hands were blistered from the reins, her legs cramping from hours in the saddle. But every time she thought about stopping, about giving up, she thought about Samuel, about the boy who'd never gotten a second chance, never gotten to see how his death might lead to something good. This was for him, all of it. They crested the final ridge just as the sun broke over the horizon, flooding the valley below with golden light, and there, in the disputed 20 acres beside the creek, two groups of armed men faced each other across a hastily constructed fence. We're too late, Cordelia whispered. No. Silas urged his horse forward. We're right on time. They rode down into the valley at a gallop, Cordelia's borrowed mare keeping pace with Silas's mountain horse. The men turned as they approached, rifles raising, suspicion and anger written across every face. Tom Brennan stepped forward. Silas, get out of here, and take Miss Van Doren with you. This doesn't concern either of you anymore. That's where you're wrong, Uncle Tom. Silas dismounted and helped Cordelia down, his hand steady on her waist. This concerns everyone in this territory, and we have something you all need to see. Cordelia pulled the sealed documents from her saddlebag, her hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. She held them up so both families could see the official territorial seal. This land, these 20 acres you're about to kill each other over, is now under official territorial review. A petition has been filed to designate it as protected land, held in trust for all citizens. As of midnight last night, it cannot be claimed by any private party until the Territorial Committee rules on the petition. Jack Hartley spat in the dirt. That's convenient. Did the Brennans put you up to this? Actually, Jacob Brennan said, stepping forward from his family's group, I didn't know anything about it until just now, but I'm glad they did it. He looked at his son, and something complicated passed between them. Pain, pride, the beginning of understanding. My boy here has more courage than any of us. He's trying to save us from ourselves. So are both of you just going to stop fighting? Cordelia asked, looking between the two patriarchs. After all these years of hatred and violence, you're going to let this go? The silence stretched out, broken only by the morning wind and the distant song of the creek. Then, slowly, Tom Brennan lowered his rifle. I'm tired, he said quietly. Lord help me. I'm just so tired of being angry all the time. Jack Hartley stared at him for a long moment. Then he too lowered his weapon. Yeah, me too. As the sun climbed higher and the tension drained from the valley like water from a broken dam, Cordelia felt Silas's hand find hers. She squeezed it tightly, hardly daring to believe what was happening. Peace. Finally. peace. And she'd helped make it possible. 6 months later, on a crisp November morning, when the first snow had dusted the mountain peaks, Cordelia Van Doren became Cordelia Mackenzie. The ceremony was simple, held in the First Presbyterian Church with fewer than 30 guests in attendance. Martha cried through the entire service. Dutch stood as Silas's best man, grinning like he'd personally arranged the whole affair. Even Jacob Brennan was there, sitting stiffly in the front pew beside Tom and several other Brennan family members, his weathered face showing cautious hope rather than the anger that had defined him for so long. The Hartleys attended too, a gesture that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable. Jack Hartley had even contributed lumber from his land for the schoolhouse being built in the valley. Cordelia wore a simple cream-colored dress. No elaborate lace, no imported silk, just good fabric that would wear well and could be used again for Sunday services. Her only jewelry was her father's pocket watch on a chain and a simple gold band that Silas had made himself from mountain gold, hammered smooth and carved with a tiny hawk in flight. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget anyone else was in the room. And when they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, she saw faces that held genuine happiness for them, rather than judgment or scandal. The town had changed, or maybe she had changed, and the town was simply reflecting that transformation back to her. The reception was held at the Golden Spur, which Dutch had closed to regular business for the afternoon. There was music, a local fiddler who knew all the old songs, and dancing, and food that people had contributed from their own tables. It wasn't the elaborate society wedding Cordelia could have had. It was better. It was real. As evening fell and guests began to depart, Cordelia found herself standing at the bar beside Martha, watching Silas talk with his father in the corner. The conversation looked serious but not hostile. Two men trying to bridge years of distance, one careful word at a time. "He's healing," Martha observed. "The rift with his father. It won't happen overnight, but they're trying." "We're all trying," Cordelia said. "Trying to be better than we were. Trying to let go of old grievances. It's hard work." "The best work usually is." Martha squeezed her hand. "Your mother would be proud of you, Miss Cordelia. And so would your brother." The mention of Samuel didn't hurt the way it once had. The wound was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed into something she could live with. Something that made her more compassionate rather than more bitter. "The school opens next month," she said. "Samuel Van Doren School. They've already got 15 students enrolled." "I heard. And I heard you and Mr. Mackenzie." Martha grinned at the name. "Donated books for the library." Seemed appropriate. Silas has read most of them anyway. Might as well share them with children who'll love them as much as he does. Later, after the guests had gone, and Dutch was cleaning up, Cordelia and Silas walked back to her house on the hill. Their house now, though they'd agreed to spend most of their time at the mountain cabin. They'd keep the town house for when they needed to conduct business or when weather made the mountains impassable, but their true home would be in the high country, where the air was clear and the stars were bright. The house felt different with Silas in it. Warmer, somehow. Less like a mausoleum of her father's ambitions, and more like an actual home. In her, there, bedroom, Cordelia sat at her vanity and unpinned her hair while Silas stood at the window, looking out over Red Creek below. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, catching his eye in the mirror. He turned, smiling. "Just thinking about the first time I saw you, storming into the Golden Spur like a force of nature, demanding to know if I knew who you were. And you told me I was the most beautiful woman there. You were. You are." He moved behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "But the most remarkable thing about you isn't your beauty, Cordelia. It's your courage. The way you chose to change, to grow, to let yourself be vulnerable even when it terrified you." She turned on the stool to face him, taking his hands in hers. "You made that possible. You saw something in me worth loving, even when I'd forgotten it was there. No." He pulled her to her feet, wrapped his arms around her. "I just reminded you. You did all the hard work yourself." They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, and Cordelia marveled at how much her life had changed in less than a year. She'd gone from a lonely woman, hiding behind walls of pride and social pretension, to someone who knew how to love and be loved, who could admit mistakes and ask for help, who understood that true strength came from vulnerability rather than armor. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing the question he'd posed months ago at his cabin. "Now." He smiled against her hair. "Now we live. We love each other. We visit the mountains and help build the school and try to be good neighbors to everyone in Red Creek. We read too many books and carve too many wooden animals and drink coffee on the porch while watching the sunrise." He pulled back to look at her face. "We make a life that's ours, not anyone else's." "How does that sound?" "Perfect," she whispered. "It sounds perfect." The next morning, they loaded a wagon with supplies and headed up to Eagle Ridge. The mountain cabin awaited them, and with it a future that neither of them could have imagined a year ago. As they climbed higher and Red Creek fell away behind them, Cordelia felt the last of her old life releasing its hold. She was no longer the untouchable Cordelia Van Doren, ruling her small empire with fear and loneliness. She was simply Cordelia, wife, friend, woman, learning to live with an open heart in a complicated world. And when they reached the cabin and Silas helped her down from the wagon, when he kissed her in the clearing where the creek sang and the mountains rose like cathedral walls around them, she understood something fundamental. Home wasn't a place you inherited or purchased or defended against all comers. Home was wherever someone saw you completely and loved you anyway. She'd found her home, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything